Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the second creation account, that is the one that's found in Genesis chapter 2 in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. First of all, we have to ask, why are there two separate accounts of creation? And in a sense, I've asked you a trick question because really I'm going to suggest that these two accounts are really one account that are joined at the hip, and yet they do come in two parts. Genesis chapter 1, we see the heavens and the earth created in 6 days. In Genesis chapter 2, we're going to continue that story, seeing the creation of man, and yet we saw the creation of man in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, and yet we go back and take a closer look, the creation of the man and the woman. They're both mentioned in chapter 1, but now there's a much more detailed telling of the story, and this time there's no time element mentioned as far as day 1, day 2, day 6, any of that. In Genesis chapter 1, man's creation is climactic. We build up, in the first day there's light, and then division between the waters, and then the dry land, and finally we get to day 6, and finally we get to the creation of man. In Genesis chapter 2, man's creation is actually going to be mentioned early on. It will be mentioned in verse 7, we see the creation of man, and it's not until the end of the chapter that we see the creation of woman. In Genesis chapter 1, we have a panorama of creation as a whole. In Genesis chapter 2, there's a detailed focus on one particular aspect of creation, that is the creation of man and woman, and the placing them into the garden. In Genesis chapter 1, it centers on God creating the heavens and the earth. In Genesis chapter 2, we see man and woman as the completion of God's creation, that we're not completely done until we get to the creation of woman as well. Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 then says, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven." Notice that phrase, that word, the account. This is the account. Actually, in the Hebrew word is toledoth, which is a plural. These are the accountings, or I think a better translation might be, these are the generations. And the reason I say that is because this comes from the root word yalad, which means to give birth. And so generations has a, sort of the idea of that which is generated or that which is born. And so these are the birthings, or the results of what came about after the heavens and the earth. That's the idea that's being presented here. Notice also, this is the account of the heavens and the earth in the day when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven. Now, previously in chapter 1, we saw God doing this, and we noted that that's the Hebrew word Elohim. That's just the Hebrew word for God. It's plural. But here we have the addition of the name of God, Yahweh Elohim, or, the Jewish folk don't like to pronounce the name of God, and so they'll often pronounce that as Adonai, and that's okay. You can read what looks like Yahweh, and you can pronounce that Adonai, and that's perfectly okay. That's a long established custom, but that's the name of God. Now, we see the meaning of that name not until we get to the book of Exodus, and God himself is going to explain that to Moses. But already here we see it being used in the Genesis account. And so this shift in the title and or name of God being used in this part of the account, we did not see that in chapter 1. We didn't see it in the first part of chapter 2, the first 3 verses, but now we do see it. And that's the covenant name of God. And maybe it points to that personal sort of touch where God's going to get personally involved here as the Lord God made earth and heaven. Now we read in verse 5 that no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field, and when you say field, don't think farmer's field, just in other words, the sort of field and stream, the wild out there. In fact, that might be a good way of describing it. Now no shrub of the wild was yet in the earth, and no plant of the wild had yet sprouted, but field works too. For the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. Notice there was a problem there. There was no plant life, And the reason why that no plant life is steady is because there's no rain yet, and there's no man to cultivate it. And so that process of having no rain, that's going to be corrected in verse 6. And the problem of no man, that's going to be corrected in verse 7. So this is setting the stage for what is to come. In verse 6 then, but a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. Now we compare this to some other translations. For example, the New International Version says, but streams, and that plural isn't accurate because it's whatever the word is, it's singular, but streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Or the New Jerusalem Bible says, instead water, and here's the translation, water flowed out of the ground. Now the water part is sort of interpretive, because the word water isn't there, but the word flow actually might work. But there was a flow that used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. Now that flow could have been a mist, or it could have been what we call streams of water. Which was it? I'm not entirely sure. Job seems to use that same term in a way that does describe stuff falling from the sky. But you can even talk about how water is flowing from the sky when it rains. Sometimes we say it's raining buckets. So that word mist, ed, is the short little Hebrew word. As we noted, Job chapter 36, verse 27-28, for he draws up the drops of water, they distill rain from the, here again, the New American Standard has translated it mist, from the flow, which the clouds pour down and they drip upon man abundantly. Sort of a poetic slice. So was it a mist? Was it streams? I don't know, but it came, notice it was coming from the earth. Again, that sounds a little bit like maybe streams. Or it could be mist, and they watered the whole surface of the ground. In whatever case, water is provided. Now we get to chapter 2, verse 7. Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Now, notice the term for man. Adam is the Hebrew word. This is the same term we saw earlier back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where God says, let us make man in his image. So that term Adam is going to be used of both his name, but it's also what he is. He is man. And man is made of the dust from the Adama. It's a play on words. The Adam is made from the dust of Adama, the ground. So the word for ground is where you get the name of man from, because that connotates his origins. Next, I want you to see that God breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. Literally, the breath of lives. It's plural, but don't think of multiple lives like soul and spirit and things like that. Instead, it's that dual sort of plural sort of thing that's just impacting how wonderful it is. You almost can't put your finger on it. It's all over the person. He breathes into his nostrils the breath of lives. Almost calls to mind from our 21st century looking at this, maybe sort of an ancient CPR as God goes and blows into him, and now man becomes a living being. When it says that man becomes a living being, the Hebrew term there, literally a living soul, and yet we should not think in terms of, oh, now this is what sets man apart from the rest of creation, because that same phrase, living soul, was used back in chapter 1, verse 24, when God made the living creatures after their kind, living souls, I guess we could translate that. And so it's used there, and it's also going to be used in Genesis chapter 2, verse 19, when we see that God forms every beast of the field and birds of the heavens and living things. And he's going to bring them to man to see what they're going to be called. And so this really orients man to as part of the rest of creation. He becomes a living being just like the other living beings that God had created. Now, the Apostle Paul quotes this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, where he says, so it's also written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. And then he goes on to say, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. What he's doing, he's contrasting that first Adam that we saw in Genesis chapter 2 with the last Adam, that's Jesus. And he goes on to say, just as we have borne the image of the earthy, that is, we, were born and there is about us that physical aspect that is like our ancestor Adam. In fact, we even call ourselves man. That's what the word Adam means. So also we will bear the image of the heavenly. We have another, I'm going to say this, another one who's our pattern after who we are being formed, and we're going to be like Jesus. He is our last Adam.